Good morning to all of you. This is in fact an old presentation that we have been making some time ago already. In fact, authorization is a brand new process, and in the beginning I think everyone was more or less focalizing on registration, and registration. Despite the fact that since 2008 the first substances were presented as being substances of very high concern and coming into the candidate list, but authorization was still something far away. It became a little bit closer when we got the first prioritization for substances coming into Annex 14, but even there you saw that the deadline was still rather far away. But there was a lot of interest in the market, there was a lot of tension, and you heard more or less whatever that you could imagine related to authorization. And that's where, at a certain moment in time, Hugo, Amaya, myself, but also people from Ekka have been doing a kind of brainstorming on what is authorization about, what are all the messages that we are hearing, and how can we rectify this a little bit. And this resulted, in fact, in 12 what we are calling unauthorized myths on authorization. The first one is entering the candidate list is the first step in banning the substance. I think it's important to remind that, first of all, not all substances on the candidate list are selected immediately for authorization. There is a kind of annual selection via this prioritization. This prioritization is not a political choice, but is clearly based on some criteria which are, first of all, mentioned in the legal text, and for which the committee which is responsible for this, the Member State Committee, has been developing a kind of algorithm which is giving a weight on the different issues which are indeed mentioned in the legal text. It's also something which it has an effect. It's very clear from the moment that substances are coming into the candidate list, it triggers a certain effect on downstream users, which are well aware that one day or another this may indeed lead to authorization and to a certain pressure for substitution, which is also an integral part of the legislation. But it's not a banning as such. If authorities really want to ban a substance for all uses, this can only be done by restriction. Authorization is a kind of, you get a kind of wild card that you can buy if you prove that your case is good enough to get into the authorization process. And of course, there is also a kind of stimulus to look for alternatives, which is then hoped by authorities to trigger indeed research and development, resulting in innovation, bringing new substances on the market. Another myth is on the analysis of alternatives. You need to have an alternative before you can get an authorization. It's in fact rather the other way around. And what you will have is that the non-availability of a technical feasible alternative will indeed facilitate to get an authorization. You heard yesterday already that we have two different roads into the authorization process, which is the adequate control, where this is indeed the case. But if you are looking at the socio-economic analysis route, from the moment that there is a feasible alternative, by definition, no authorization can be granted. And you have to prove this non-availability in your analysis of alternatives. And proving that they are not there, or the time that it will require to get there, is something which will have major consequences if we are looking at the review period. And that's indeed one of the most important parts of this whole application. It's not just making a statement, I need 7 years, 12 years or whatever. It really has to be underbuilt by data, and in fact your analysis of alternatives is a key issue in the discussion on the period that will be granted. Myth number 3. Ekka is responsible for granting authorizations. You heard yesterday by Anna Boras of the Commission that this is clearly not the reality. It's in fact you have 2 committees which are giving their opinion on the information they have been receiving, but it's ultimately the Commission who will grant the authorization. And this is happening via the comitology procedure, meaning that there is indeed an interaction with the member states in the REACH committee before ultimately granting this authorization. The Ekka committees, I think it's important, as Tim has been mentioning already yesterday, they are consisting of experts which are nominated by member states, but which are appointed by the management board, and both committees are indeed independent in performing their tasks. And there is a close collaboration between the 2 committees, which are ultimately coming up with one joint opinion on every proposal for authorization. The authorization process is unpredictable, including the final decision. This was the most heard criticism, and it's still the most heard criticism. But on the other hand, more or less every activity in life is somewhat uncertain. It's all, how do I interpret my dossier, my information that I have, compared to the legal text, compared to the guidance. So knowing the rules of the game is already helping in reducing the risks. And of course you have to look at the key elements. And one of the key elements is what is the remaining risk of using this substance that is in this authorization process. And there you have indeed information which will be available in the chemical safety report. The comparison between the risks of the substance that is into the authorization process can be compared to other substances which are the alternatives, to see that indeed the applicant is going in the good way and is not replacing a substance with a particular hazard by another substance having the same hazard properties. It is of course looking at the feasibility of substitutes, and it's also looking at what are the efforts that companies are doing to find an alternative. All these issues are indeed playing a role in the decision-making process, essentially related to the review period. And of course, it's also looking at, essentially, if we are looking to the socioeconomic analysis route, what are the benefits? The costs, if the authorization is not granted, compared to if it is granted, what are the real added value of continuing to use, and what are the issues related to alternatives. It's also important to understand that no decisions are made in advance. You are entering a dossier which is judged on its individual qualities by the two committees, and they come to a conclusion which is in line also with the previous dossiers they have been looking at, but nothing is decided in advance. Myth number 5. The bigger my dossier, the better. Our experiences is more or less the contrary, as you heard yesterday as well. All applications for authorizations got so far what I should call a green light from the two committees, but you see indeed completely different periods for the review period, going from 2 years until 12 years. And you see indeed that there is clearly no linear relationship between the number of pages in the dossier and the review period. It's even more or less the opposite. The more simple, the more convincing, the clearer your dossier is, the higher the chance that you are passing, and that you are passing with the review period that you have been asking for. So it's important to understand that you really have to structure your demonstration. You have to convince a committee that you have a good story. So it's important that you don't dilute a strong message with an overload of information. And yesterday we heard also already by Tim that one picture is sometimes telling more than 1,000 phrases. But there is a lot of other things. You can indeed come up with a kind of structured presentation of the risks related to the different working contribution scenarios, environmental contribution scenarios. All this kind of facilitating is helpful for the committee and for the rapporteurs that have to go through the dossier to really understand what's ongoing and what they are looking at. And it's also very clear that you are on the right track if the consequences of not granting the authorization are clearly having a negative effect for society. The next one. I need a fully monetized socioeconomic analysis to get my authorization. There again, what is it all about? Which kind of monetization? Resource costs? That's probably the most simple one. Quantities are no, prices are no, but the impact on human health, on environment, are generally speaking much more difficult. And even within human health you see major differences where if you start about talking about cancer, where we have indeed a rather good idea of what are the costs related to that, which is becoming much more difficult if we are looking at consequences for reproductive toxicity, for PBT substances, what are the costs of to the environment. There you see that we are still in a kind of laboratory looking at development of new tools, and I think it's important to refer here also to NERSAP, which is a group, which is a network, which is looking at indeed how do we look at this socioeconomic analysis and the analysis of alternatives, for which you can find the information on the Ekka website. And if you are interested, you can join that network to really help ourselves to progress also in these much more difficult aspects. But it's important that you have to feel comfortable that the case that you are presenting is clear, obvious. So a very clear, convincing case may be so evident that it hardly needs monetizing the risks of the use of that substance, and don't walk in the booby trap by bombarding the committee with an enormous amount of information which is not telling anything on the real socio-economic analysis. So nothing is more convincing than a robust and simple socio-economic analysis which can convince the Cefic committee. Myth number 7. The socio-economic analysis and the analysis of alternatives are containing tons of confidential business information. You saw already yesterday that there is an amazing evolution from the first case where we got more or less 50% of the dossier which was said to be confidential, where we see now that less than 10% of the socio-economic analysis is considered by companies to be confidential business information. It's all on showing what is crucial in your dossier. Why do you need an authorization for that substance in that application? And in the vast majority of the cases, the CBI information is hardly making the difference. And it is indeed limited to information which you are not allowed to share or not allowed to discuss with other companies, as we have in the rules which are described by the World Trade Organization. So a qualitative or semi-quantitative analysis not revealing confidential business information is, generally speaking, as or even better convincing to clear the opinions and to favorize the decision making. Myth number 8. My manufacturer is not interested to apply, so I can't use this substance after the sunset date. Well, it's clear that indeed in the beginning everyone got in mind that authorization that will be essentially manufacturers, importers that are going for an authorization. What we've learned so far that is that in reality you see it is as much, for not saying even more, downstream users which are looking at their case and may go themselves for their authorization. You heard yesterday as well that indeed there is a kind of difference if a manufacturer or importer is going for an authorization. The entire supply chain below is indeed covered. In the case of a downstream user, it's only one step up, which is covered by the authorization. And applying higher in the supply chain for a given use is indeed beneficial for the entire supply chain of the use, but you are confronted with difficulties of getting the information, the difficulty of having different socioeconomic aspects related to different use in different sectors, which is ultimately pushing companies in the decision-making process, whether it is more interesting for themselves to go for a more general authorization or for a much more specific downstream user authorization. The public consultation on alternatives or high risks can block the granting of my authorization. So indeed, the public consultation, the information on technical feasible alternatives may indeed be a risk. But again, it's hardly to imagine that a company which is active in a dedicated field is absolutely unaware of a kind of an existing alternative. And if this is really the case, the statistic probability that this proposed alternative is really a technical and economical feasible alternative is probably rather rare. So companies which are indeed knowing the market in which they are active are generally speaking well aware of the activities that are ongoing into that field. The Ekka committees are taking the public consultation outcome into account. Yes, they are looking at the information, but as you heard, there is this trialogue, which is also allowing a kind of discussion between the applicant, between Ekka, between the rapporteurs, and between those having contributed into this public consultation to really verify whether yes or no the alternative is technically and economically feasible. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges that the Cefic committee is confronted with. They get information, but it's sometimes rather difficult to verify if they hear someone saying white, someone saying black, and where is the reality between these two extremes. It's also clear that you can reduce the risk by indeed assessing in a realistic way what is economically and technically feasible. And also mentioned yesterday, it's of course extremely important to have a good and clear description of this broad information of uses in order to get interesting contributions in the public consultation. The broader, the more vague your description, the broader the proposals that will come on the table that you have to verify and to say why this is indeed not relevant for your business. And again, we see that there are completely different parties which are contributing into the process, but generally speaking, the relevant alternatives may come rather from industry than from NGOs, and it's sometimes also much more difficult to defend yourself and to find out why the proposed alternatives from industry are not feasible in your case. Joint applications are cheaper than separate ones. You have to take everything into consideration. You may lose a lot of money to save 10,000 euro for one dedicated use. So do never forget that authorization is a business case. It's a business decision. You have to look at it for your company and then ultimately make the right solution. Where do you go to? Are you going for a joint application, or are you preferring to present your case, which may be extremely particular, having its very own socioeconomic impacts, and present it as such? So the series of specific uses may be cheaper in the end than covering all the uses in one file. And that's also the place where you will consider the confidential business information, to what extent is this playing a role in choosing between joint and separate. The precise description of uses is confidential. Well, you heard already the evolution that we heard yesterday as well. The first impression that you have on confidentiality is maybe not the correct one. We have been feeling that there is a kind of uncomfortable feeling on what is confidential and what not. And in many cases, if you look on internet, Wikipedia, whatever, where you find a lot of uses, everything you find over there is clearly not confidential. And that's also where I should say that you sometimes within one company that you are seeing major differences between the regulatory people, which are claiming certain information publicly available. And if you go to the public website of the same company, salespeople have been probably putting a lot of this information publicly available on their website. And that's something which is easily verified by Ekka, by rapporteurs and indeed take that into consideration. I think we have been progressing already quite a lot, seeing 50% versus more than 90% not confidential anymore. Myth number 12, you can't apply after the latest application date or after the sunset date. No, you can apply whenever you want. It has only some consequences. If you are applying before the latest application date, you are indeed covered that you can remain on the market until ultimately the Commission has been coming out with its decision. In the other case, you are obliged to stop your activity until you have receiving the authorization. But even there, I have to be prudent. It's not all black and white. So if you are applying before or during the latest application window, you can, without any concern, continuing your activities even after the sunset date until we have the outcome of the Commission. And for the rest, it's up to you. You will find a lot of information which is not limited to the Ekka website, but also all the European industry associations are offering quite some guidance on the authorization, also for downstream users, and we have been making a joint document on this with different industry associations. And that's what I wanted to share with you on the unauthorized myths of authorization. Thank you.